16th chapter of the book of Revelation is one of the most exciting chapters in the Bible. And I'll give you two reasons why that's so. First of all, Revelation 16 is one of a very small number of chapters in the Bible where we can actually identify where we are in the outworking of the purpose of God. We can look at the broad spread of the purpose of God and say, this has happened, but that hasn't happened yet. And Revelation 16 is one of those chapters where we can actually pick out where we are. The other thing is that Revelation 16 is one of another very small group of chapters in the Scriptures where we can identify at what point in the outworking of the purpose of God the Lord Jesus Christ returns. You can draw a red line between two verses, or maybe in the middle of a verse, and say, that's where the Lord returns. And there are very, very few chapters in the Bible where both of those things hold true. So that we can see not only where we are, but where the Lord Jesus returns. And Revelation 16 is one of those chapters, which is why I find it so exciting. The flip side of all that are these two things. First of all, you're going to have to wait till the second class before we actually look at that, because it's in the sixth vial. And secondly, whether you get as excited as I am about that depends on your view of the book of Revelation. Because there are three ways of interpreting the book of Revelation, as you may be aware. There's first of all the preterite view, which says that most of the signs and symbols in the book of Revelation were fulfilled in the past, back in the time of the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman army in AD 70. That was what most of the focus of Revelation was about. And the rest is going to be fulfilled in a relatively short period of time. 3.5 years, or maybe it's 7 years, depending on who you read, right at the time of the end, just about the time of the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the preterite view. The futurist view says that only a very small part of the book of Revelation has already been fulfilled. First 4 seals, probably, in chapter 6. And all of the rest of it is going to be fulfilled in a short period of time, 3.5 years, or maybe 7, depending on who you read, right at the time of the end, just before the Lord Jesus Christ returns. And then there's the continuous historic view, which says that the book of Revelation has been being fulfilled from almost the very time that it was written, almost before the ink was dry on the parchment, right down to our own day and beyond. I'm working on a chart which isn't ready for publication yet, sadly, but a chart that shows every year from AD 96 to 2016. And in every single calendar year on that chart, some part of the book of Revelation is being fulfilled. There is not a single gap of a year. It is continuous and it's historic. Now, the next thing we want to notice is that those three views of the book of Revelation, the preterite, the futurist and the continuous historic, are all to be found in the pages of the Bible. So let's turn to the second letter that the Apostle Paul was inspired to write to Timothy, and chapter 2, and see that there were members in the ecclesia in Ephesus who held a preterite view of prophecy. Not a preterite view of Revelation, because Revelation hadn't been written then, but a preterite view of prophecy. And not only do we see this, but we also see what God thinks of these views. So, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 16. But shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness, and their word will doth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some. Now, just look at the detail in those verses. The teaching of these individuals, Hymenaeus and Philetus, leads to ungodliness. Wrong doctrine always results in wrong walk. And the right understanding of when the resurrection happens is part of the truth. Because the apostle says, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already. So see, the understanding of prophecy, the right understanding of prophecy, isn't something you can sort of have as an optional extra. in addition to your faith in the saving work of Christ, it's all part of the truth that's revealed in the Scriptures. And the result of this error of these two individuals was the faith of some was overthrown. So it's a pretty serious issue. And the Apostle Paul is warning Timothy against these people. So that's the preterite view. Now what about the futurist view? Well, turn much further back now to the prophecy of Ezekiel in chapter 12. God was revealing through Ezekiel, his prophet, what was going to happen to the city of Jerusalem and the people who were living there. That the city was going to be taken by the Babylonians. And many of the people were going to be slain, and some of them were going to go into captivity. And there were people around in Ezekiel's day who were mocking all this. Ezekiel chapter 12 and verse 22. And the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, what is that proverb that ye have in the land of Israel, saying, The days are prolonged, and every vision faileth? Oh, what Ezekiel's talking about, it's a long way off into the future. Not going to happen in our times. Maybe it won't even happen at all. Verse 23, Tell them therefore, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, I will make this proverb to cease, that they shall no more use it as a proverb in Israel. But say unto them, The days are at hand, and the effect of every vision. For there shall be no more any vain vision, nor flattering divination within the house of Israel. For I am Yahweh, I will speak, and the word that I shall speak shall come to pass. It shall be no more prolonged. For in your days, O rebellious house, will I say the word, and will perform it, saith the Lord Yahweh. Again, the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, behold, they of the house of Israel say, The vision that he seeth is for many days to come, and he prophesieth of times that are far off. That's futurism. Therefore say unto them, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, There shall none of my words be prolonged any more, but the word that I have spoken shall be done, saith the Lord Yahweh. God sent Ezekiel to warn them. They made his words of none effect by their interpretations. Oh, it's a long way off. It's way into the future. We're okay. Jerusalem isn't going to fall anytime soon. And God remonstrated with his people, and particularly with those who held that view. Now what about the continuous historic? Well, turn to Matthew 24, the Olivet prophecy of the Lord Jesus Christ. And remembering it is the same Lord Jesus Christ who gave this revelation to his servant John. And just look at the structure of the Olivet prophecy in Matthew chapter 24. The disciples had asked the question in verse 3, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the age? That was the question. When is it going to happen, Lord? Now, as we go through, just notice the time words. Verse 4, Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. So there's going to be some other views about. There's going to be some different interpretations. There's going to be some false prophets. Verse 6, And ye shall hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. See the time marker. Wars and rumours of wars, they are not a sign of the end. No, the end's some way after. 4 verse 7, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. So watch, he says. When you see these things, know that this is the beginning of a sequence. Verse 9, Then, after that, shall they deliver you to be afflicted, and they shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my sake. And then, another time word, shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and hate one another, as a result of that persecution. And many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many. Verse 14, And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. So there's another marker. The gospel's got to go out and be preached in all the Roman world. And the epistle to the Colossians, the Apostle Paul says that happened. It was done in his day. And then shall the end come. End of verse 14. After the gospel has been preached to all nations. So verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth let him understand, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field turn back to take his clothes, etc. That's the final sign. When you see the abomination of desolation, interpreted in the Gospel of Luke as Jerusalem encompassed with armies. And it was at the end of this sequence. And those who had heard the Lord's words and understood them said, this is it. Jerusalem's surrounded with armies. He said, get out. How do we do it? And then suddenly the Romans withdrew and out they went, the faithful ones. And they went to Pella and they survived. And then the Romans came in, ring of steel around the city, and that was it. See how continuous this prophecy is. Step by step, Jesus is taking them through the events which he knew would happen, that they might know where they were in the outworking of the purpose of God and might be ready when the key event came. Now, this continuous historic view of prophecy has been around for centuries. Let me just show you a quotation that goes back over 1,000 years. This is a quotation from a Roman Catholic archbishop who has read 2 Thessalonians 2 and the epistles of John and has understood that those prophecies apply to his own pope. Archbishop Arnulf of Reims in 991 AD said of his own pope, surely, if he is empty of charity and filled with vain knowledge and lifted up, he is Antichrist, sitting in God's temple and showing himself as God. Quoting there from the epistles of John and 2 Thessalonians 2. He understood those prophecies and correctly applied them back in 991 AD. Now, the Reformation, which took place after the dark Middle Ages, revived interest in the Bible. And Protestants started to study the Bible and see that these prophecies indeed were about the papal system, the Roman Catholic system. And then the Counter-Reformation took place, and the papacy tried to counter what had happened in the Reformation. And so his Jesuits started writing expositions of the book of Revelation. And in 1603, the Jesuit Alcazar wrote a book which was called Investigation of the Ancient Sense of the Apocalypse, which was a preterite view of Revelation and pointed everything into the past. And in 1585, the Jesuit Ribera published his commentary on Revelation, which was a futurist view and pointed everything forward to the future. The attempt was to, as it were, throw the Protestants off the scent, to point them in other directions. I'm going to show you a couple of cartoons which come out of Brother Ron Abel's book on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, which illustrate this. So here's the pure river of water of life, and it's being contaminated by these Jesuits throwing their expositions of Revelation into the stream and muddying the waters. And you've got all these Protestants down here who are pulling them out and reading them and saying, oh, this is good stuff, and then teaching their scholars. Whereas other Protestants are saying, no, all this futurism's wrong, and all these preterite ideas are wrong. And the lists are there. If you get Brother Ron's book, you can see which of these scholars were sound in taking a continuous historic view, which were futurists, and which are preterites. And here's the other one. So here's all the Protestants, Bishop Eliot, there's Wycliffe there, and Tyndale, and Sir Isaac Newton, all firing their cannon at the Pope, Revelation 13, 2 Thessalonians 2, the prophecies of Daniel. And the Jesuits are saying, no. Here's the Antichrist, way back in pagan Rome. fire behind. And this other lot of Jesuits are saying, no, no, fire higher. There's the Antichrist. He's way into the future. They're trying to divert the fire away from the Pope. And sadly, those views have come into Christadelphia. And I'm going to put on the screen now 2 quotations taken from 2 books on the book of Revelation, written by Christadelphians, specifically about our subject tonight, Revelation 16. Here's the first one. This is the Preterite view. Biblical exposition of the 7 vials is extremely difficult, partly because their final fulfillment appears to be still in the future. See how vague the language is. But he doesn't know what the vials are about, because he thinks they're in the future. And here's the futurist one. As to the interpretation of these signs, the uncertainty in connection with the still future trumpets, because he believes the trumpets haven't been fulfilled yet, is yet more a factor here. So we don't know what the trumpets are, we haven't got a clue what the vials are going to be about. So if I took the Preterite view or the futurist view, and was standing here this afternoon, I really wouldn't have anything to say to you. But I don't. I take the continuous historic view. That we have first of all the seals, which are judgment on pagan Rome, from the time of the writing of the Apocalypse, AD 96, to AD 324, when the last pagan emperor was overthrown. Then the trumpets, judgment on Christian Rome, AD 395 to AD 1685. And then the vials, judgment on the Holy Roman Empire, which is our subject tonight, the first 5 vials particularly, and then we shall go on obviously later in the second talk to the 6th and the 7th. Now, if you look at the whole overall structure of Revelation, there are just no gaps. It is continuous. You can see the 7th seal going on there, and the 7th trumpet going on. There are no gaps. So let's turn to Revelation 16. Well, actually 15 and 16, because 15 is the introduction to chapter 16. And let's just take an overview of these chapters. Before we start getting into the detail about what this vision is about, let's just have a look at the language. So, Revelation 16 verse 9. Men were scorched with great heat and blasphemed the name of God, which had power over these plagues, it says. There are plagues here. Revelation 16 and verse 4. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. So what rivers turned into blood? Revelation 16 and verse 13. I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs. So we got frogs around. Verse 2. There fell a noisome and grievous sore upon men. Verse 21. There fell upon men a great hail out of heaven. Verse 10. The 5th angel poured out his vial upon the throne of the beast, as we shall see in a minute, and his kingdom was full of darkness. So 16 verse 10 again, there's the throne. It is thronos in the Greek, the throne of the beast. And 16 verse 12. The 6th angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up. And finally, back in chapter 15 and verse 3, we've got people singing the song of Moses. So when you just look at those 9 words and phrases on the screen, where do they take you back to? Well, they take us back to the Exodus and the plagues which God brought upon Egypt, and Israel going out and crossing through the Red Sea, and on the other side singing the song of Moses. So why is Revelation 15 and 16 pulling all this language out of the early chapters of Exodus? What's going on? Well, what was going on in those early chapters of Exodus? God was pouring out his judgments upon Pharaoh's Egypt, on the political religious power, because the plagues, remember, were against all the gods of Egypt, the political religious power which was persecuting God's people, the nation of Egypt. So then we would expect, because Revelation by the Spirit draws all that language out of that context, we should expect a parallelism. And there is indeed one. Because Revelation 16 is about the judgments of God poured out on a political religious power or powers which were persecuting God's people. And we're going to see in the first part the Catholic Holy Roman Empire, and in the second part the Muslim Ottoman Empire, which are judged by God. So there's our first bit of background. That's what's going on. And this is, of course, the third series of 7 judgments. We've got the seals in chapter 6, the trumpets in chapters 8 and 9, and now the vials in chapter 16. Not got time to go through this in detail, but there are a whole series of parallels between the trumpets and the vials. And we're going to pick up one or two of these as we go through. But you see the parallelism of language. God is judging a similar system in each case. The Christian Roman Empire in chapters 8 and 9, the Holy Roman Empire in chapter 16. So, how do we establish what the vials are all about? Well, what's the context in Revelation of chapter 16? Chapter 15 is clearly the introduction, so it's not chapter 15. So, is the context of Revelation 16 chapter 14? Well, if you look at chapter 14, we find it begins with the Lamb standing on the Mount Zion with 144,000 with his Father's name written in their foreheads. So, the Lord Jesus Christ is now on the earth. The saints have been judged. They have been immortalised. And in verse 6, the everlasting gospel goes forth to all the nations. That's quite a bit further forward than we are in Revelation chapter 16, where we have, as we shall see in part 2, the actual return of Jesus to the earth. So I would suggest that Revelation 14 is not the background to chapter 16. It's actually further on than chapter 16. So we go back to Revelation chapter 13. Verse 1, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea. There's a clue. Because we've got a beast in Revelation 16 verse 10, and we've got a beast in Revelation 16 verse 13, which we shall come to in a bit. So here's a beast rising up out of the sea. He's got 7 heads and 10 horns, 10 crowns, names of blasphemy, and he's a composite beast of all the bits and pieces of the 4 beasts of Daniel chapter 7. And notice at the end of verse 2 of Revelation 13, the dragon gave him his power and his throne, same word as chapter 16 verse 10, where the 5th angel poured out his vial upon the throne of the beast. So there's a link. And great authority. And then we see in chapter 13 the rise of the beast of the earth in verse 11. I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And chapter 13 goes on to tell us some of the things which this earth beast did, and finishes up with his number, but doesn't tell us anything about his end. So I suggest that chapter 13 is actually a precursor to chapter 16, where we are going to see the end of the beast. This is where he starts. So, Revelation 13, we've got the rise of the sea beast, the persecution of the saints there in verse 7, and then we've got the rise of the earth beast. It tells us about the mark of the beast and his number, and that's where it stops. So, it will be reasonable, I suggest, to assume that Revelation 13 stops there, and then Revelation 16 picks up, because we have the throne of the beast affected in the 5th vial. Chapter 12 is clearly about an earlier time. It's about the rise of, first of all, the pagan Roman dragon, and then the Christian Roman dragon, which followed on from him. But if we go back to chapter 11, we find the two witnesses in chapter 11, and chapter 11 verse 13, "The same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell. And in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted, and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly." And the great earthquake there can be identified as the French Revolution. And I believe that Revelation 11 leads up to the point where Revelation 16 starts. Because the French Revolution was the great catalyst which led to the end of the Holy Roman Empire after 1,000 years. And it's the last event that's recorded under the sixth trumpet. And then when we come to Revelation 16, we get the outpouring of the vials, bearing in mind that the seventh trumpet, as we saw on the earlier chart, just continues on. So then, Revelation chapter 16 and verse 1. "I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the seven angels, Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast." That's a link back to Revelation 13, because that's where we saw the mark of the beast appear. "And upon them which worshipped his image." And the image is a link back to Revelation 13, because the earth beast created an image and caused men to worship it. So we've got some clear links of language back to our foundation chapters in Revelation 13 and Revelation 11. So, what was the state of affairs in France at the end of the 18th century? Well, France was divided into three groups, which were called the first, second and third estates. The first estate was simply and solely the Roman Catholic clergy. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. They made up 0.5% of the population of France. They lived in incredible riches, and they paid no taxes. The second estate was the nobility and the artisans, what we might call the upper and middle classes today. The nobility, they also paid no taxes, 1.5% of the population. The third estate, the merchants, the artisans, the peasants, 98% of the population, paid half their income in taxes to maintain the government and the nobility and the Roman Catholic clergy in the positions they were accustomed to. And the third estate didn't like this. But when the Estates General were called together, all three of them, the first and second ones could outvote the third. Although they were a tiny percentage of the number of the population, they had 2 votes for 1. So they always outvoted the third estate. And humanism began to rise in the third estate. They began to question the divine right of kings to rule and the church to say what was right and what was wrong. And eventually the people revolted. The people of the third estate revolted against the first and second estates. 1789, with the cry "Liberty, Equality and Fraternity," which you can see on the great buildings in France. And the Catholic Church and the government of France were overthrown. The leader of the revolution was Maximilien Robespierre, and there was a Frenchman called Monsieur Guillotine, who invented a very handy device for cutting people's heads off. And tens of thousands were killed in what was called the Reign of Terror, including most of the Catholic clergy. There fell a noisome and grievous sore, says Revelation 16 verse 1, upon the men which had the mark of the beast and them which worshipped his image, those who were involved with Catholicism. And the revolutionaries went to, that's the siege of the Bastille, incidentally, the bottom picture, which is where they got a lot of guns and ammunition from and were able to prosecute their revolution further. But the zeal of the revolutionaries went to this point, that's a photograph of part of the facade of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And across the front of Notre Dame there are all these statues of kings. Now, they're supposed to be the kings of Judah who are in the line of the Lord Jesus Christ. But you notice this one here is holding a cross, which doesn't quite sit comfortably with the King of Judah. But the revolutionaries believed that they were kings of France, so they chopped the heads off all of the statues, because they didn't think it was right for a man to wear a crown on his head. They were absolutely against monarchy and royalty. And after the revolution, of course, eventually the statues were restored. But that was the sort of extent that they went to. And they turned Notre Dame into a corn store. They said there was a goddess of reason, which they worshipped. And they changed everything that they could change, including the calendar. They had a 10-day week. They were all for the metric system. But it didn't work. And eventually Robespierre went to the guillotine because they thought he'd got too much power. And a group of people known as the Directory ruled France. All the surrounding nations in Europe were going to war against France because they didn't want this spirit of revolution to spread to their countries. They didn't want their kings and queens to have their heads cut off. So Europe was aflame with warfare. Revelation 16 verse 3. And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. And so the British, who were the greatest naval power in the world, blockaded Europe to stop trade going to France and any nation that supported France. And Admiral Nelson, of course, won major victories against the French and the Spanish in the Battle of the Nile and the Battle of Trafalgar. And Napoleon was unable to invade Britain. It was one of the things that he wanted to do. So he had to turn inland. And Britannia ruled the waves. And then we come to the third vial. Chapter 16 and verse 4. The third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shall be, because thou hast judged this. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. Just turn back to Revelation 13 and verse 7. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. They mercilessly persecuted anybody who even had a Bible, let alone believed the truth. And so the French found all the nations of Europe warring against them. And in the French army was a young officer called Napoleon Bonaparte, who rose in the ranks and became a master of artillery. And with it he defeated successive European armies. He waged land campaigns in North Italy and Switzerland and Austria, the source of all Europe's major rivers. And between 1796 and 1797 he won 26 key battles in that area of Europe, the high ground where all the rivers rise and flow down into the various seas that surround Europe. And it was Napoleon, General Napoleon at that stage, who won all those victories. Came back to Paris in 1795, and he found the Directory in trouble. The people were rebelling now against the Directory. They'd executed Robespierre. They now didn't like the rule of the Directory. So Napoleon arranged his famous cannon around, and when the mobs came into the square, he opened fire. And he went to the Directory and said, I've quelled the revolt with a whiff of grape shot. And that was the end of the revolt. But in 1799, Napoleon had accumulated enough power to overthrow the Directory, and he became the first consul of France. And within that sphere of the landmass of Europe, he was virtually the ruler. Everywhere he went in that area in the circle, he won victories. Every time he tried to go outside the circle, to invade Britain, to go into the Middle East, and finally to go into Russia, he was defeated. God was constraining him into the area where God wanted him to work. Chapter 16, verse 8. And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, And power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. In 1806, to be precise, on the 6th of August 1806, Napoleon went to Vienna and dethroned the Emperor Francis II, a member of the family of the Habsburgs, who are still around to this day. Some of you may remember the incident in the European Parliament when Pope John Paul II went to address the European Parliament. And Ian Paisley stood up with a banner saying, "No Popery." And a member of the European Parliament rushed across the chamber and wrestled the banner out of his hand. That was Otto von Habsburg, the lineal descendant of the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who saw it as his duty to defend his pope. These are the two horns of the beast of the earth of Revelation chapter 13, the emperor and the papacy. And we'll look at that in a little more detail in part 2. Napoleon was known as the man of fire because of his use of cannon. Power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. In the Battle of Austerlitz, which was one of his most famous victories, his spies stole the trumpet signals of the Russian armies. And Napoleon in the morning mist arraigned his cannon and then got the French trumpeters to blow the Russian signals and lure the Russian army forward. And they came forward rank after rank, straight into the line of fire of his cannon, and were cut down. He was indeed the man of fire. And by 1808 he was the emperor of virtually all of Europe. But there was one horn of the beast left. He'd overthrown the imperial horn, but there was still the papal horn. Verse 10. And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the throne of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. So Napoleon went to Italy, and he took Pope Pius VI prisoner and jailed him in France. And there in the top picture is the Pope and his minions pleading with Napoleon to spare them, and Napoleon wouldn't. So they elected a new Pope, Pius VII, put him on the papal throne in Rome. In April 1809 Napoleon came back and took the next Pope prisoner and put him in jail in Fontainebleau in France. And the Roman state was abolished. The Pope was banished from Rome. The two horns of the earth beast of Revelation 13 had both been cut off, and the Holy Roman Empire was no more. God's judgments had been executed upon it by this remarkable man, Napoleon Bonaparte, God's instrument against the Holy Roman Empire. There's three quotations from Napoleon. I am the successor not of Louis XVI, the French king, but of Charlemagne. He went right back. Charlemagne became the emperor of Europe. We shall look at him again in part 2. Napoleon was not a religious man. If I had to choose a religion, he said, I'd worship the sun. He tasted command, he tasted power, and he went on until God had finished with him. And then he disappeared. And here's the most amazing quote of all of Napoleon, there on the left. I am the instrument of providence. She will use me as long as I accomplish her designs, and she will break me like a glass. And God did. And God removed him from power. He was exiled to the island of St. Helena, and there he died. But he was God's instrument in bringing his judgments upon the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. And he brought it to an end. And the bringing of the Holy Roman Empire to an end prepared the way for the outworking of the next stage of the purpose of God, which would be revealed when the sixth and seventh angels poured out their vials. And that's our subject for part 2.